They tried to break a hardened Navy SEAL by destroying the only soul he couldn't live without. But when his loyal German shepherd stopped breathing, something ancient stirred inside him, faith, rage, and a love stronger than death. Everyone said the fight was over, until a miracle echoed through a dying heartbeat. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Snow lingered on the concrete of the abandoned skate park, glowing faintly beneath cold streetlights. Ethan Walker walked through Hartford Ridge without haste, boots pressing thin frost into the pavement as if memory guided his steps more than intention. The city wore winter-like armor, its breath hidden in cold windows and silent alleys, and Ethan felt the weight of familiarity curling around him in ways he couldn't fully name. Years ago he had flown down the same slope ahead on a skateboard, reckless and invincible, believing gravity was just another obstacle to conquer. Now the world felt heavier, and the cheering crowds existed only inside his head, replaced by the low hum of passing cars and the steady presence of the German shepherd beside him. The dog moved with quiet vigilance, never pulling, never drifting, as if the bond between them needed no leash to hold. Ethan didn't need to speak to sense the dog's instincts. The air itself seemed to tighten around them with each shared breath. 3 months had passed since Ethan dismantled a drug ring operating near the harbor, dragging men out of shadows because he couldn't stand another overdose report in the newspaper. He had turned them in without hesitation, expecting nothing in return, but people like them didn't forget humiliation. Revenge slept lightly, especially in winter, and tonight Ethan felt that sleep beginning to stir. The rusted railing of the skate park came into view, and the shepherd halted for just a moment before continuing, ears angled toward the hollow-shaped bowl below. Ethan paused at the ridge and stared into the darkness, letting old echoes return. Scraped knees, torn shoes, his own teenage laughter soaring over concrete. The wind carried fragments of memories he had no time for, yet couldn't avoid. He exhaled slowly, and the cold seized his breath like a confession. A whistle cut through the silence, short, sharp, unmistakably deliberate. Ethan lifted his gaze and saw several silhouettes under a flickering street lamp. Their outlines were enough. He recognized them through posture, through the tension that pulled the space around them taut. "Long time, Walker," one of them called out, voice coated with resentment, barely contained. Ethan didn't answer. The shepherd's body tensed, but Ethan's hand drifted near its shoulder, grounding the animal without effort or command. "Thought you could walk away after handing us over?" another voice taunted, but Ethan sensed more fear than confidence. Bravado always sounded hollow to ears trained by combat. Before he could speak, or refuse to speak, a sudden force struck between his shoulders, a shove, calculated and practiced. For an instant he floated weightless, like the reckless boy he once was, before crashing onto the cold concrete inside the park. Pain flickered, but instinct steadied him. He rolled, bracing, rising to one knee, and froze as heavy steps echoed from a shadowed alcove. Claws scraped cement. Breath thickened into a growl half swallowed. A Pitbull emerged from darkness, not charging blindly, but advancing with a controlled menace that told Ethan this was no accident. Above, the shepherd barked, pacing along the ridge, torn between obedience and instinct. Ethan raised his hand, "Stay," and the dog halted, quivering with the effort to hold back. The figures above grew silent, satisfaction humming beneath their stillness. This moment was not improvised, but engineered, a message disguised as a threat and delivered through teeth instead of bullets. The Pitbull took another step closer, eyes fixed, not hostile, yet not gentle, trained to harm, shaped by hands that misunderstood loyalty. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest that wasn't fear, it was recognition. He had seen eyes like those overseas, in soldiers who forgot how to return to gentleness, who only knew how to endure. The shepherd's bark came again, sharper, but Ethan didn't break eye contact with the pit bull. He shifted his stance, not to attack, not to surrender, but to face the consequences of choices he couldn't undo. The silhouettes above muttered, satisfied, and then withdrew, boots crunching through snow as they vanished into the night, leaving Ethan alone with the animal forged by someone else's vengeance. For a long moment, nothing moved. The pit bull lingered like a question Ethan couldn't yet answer, then retreated into shadow as quietly as it had come. The shepherd whined, low and frustrated, and Ethan placed a steady hand on its neck once the dog rushed down the slope to reach him. The warmth beneath his palm reminded him that loyalty still existed even when dreams had fallen cold. Ethan looked toward the ridge where the men had stood. Winter was far from over, and revenge had only just begun to thaw. He felt no anger yet, only readiness, and as he and the shepherd left the park, the wind carried a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. This was just the beginning. Night pressed low over the skate park, the streetlights humming faintly above the frozen concrete. Ethan Walker felt the weight of it on his shoulders as he and the German shepherd climbed toward the edge of the bowl, each step measured not by distance, but by the length of his thoughts. He could still hear the fading crunch of boots from the men who had staged their little spectacle, could still see in his mind the way the pit bull's eyes had emerged from the dark, focused and controlled. They had not come for a fight, not yet. They had come to deliver a message. The problem was that messages like that rarely ended with one visit. He knew this pattern. He had seen it in villages overseas, in slums near ports, in the way men who felt powerless tried to seize control by creating fear. They never stopped at warnings. Warnings were just rehearsal. The shepherd walked a fraction closer than usual, its body brushing his leg, the bond between them tightening as the night breathed around them. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the arrest 3 months before, to the warehouse that smelled of chemicals and cheap cologne, to the faces of men who had believed no one would ever drag them into the light. He remembered the look one of them had given him through the backseat window of the patrol car, not wild or desperate, but cold and calculating, as if writing a debt in some invisible ledger. Maybe that man was here tonight. Maybe he was watching from the shadows right now. The idea did not scare Ethan, but it did something worse. It made him feel tired. Tired that the city he tried to protect had become a maze of grudges without end. He reached the lip of the bowl and paused to scan the surrounding park. Benches sat empty under a thin layer of frost. The chain-link fence rattled softly in the wind. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint buzz of electricity and the quiet pulse of his own heartbeat. He exhaled and told himself that leaving was the smartest choice. He had a dog to look after, a home to return to, a life he was still trying to rebuild out of shattered routines and stray kindnesses. The shepherd lifted its head, testing the air with an instinct that had saved them more than once. A flicker of unease pricked the back of Ethan's neck. He had learned long ago to trust that feeling, but tonight it arrived entangled with so many other emotions that he hesitated. Guilt for dragging his dog into his unfinished battles, anger for living in a place where doing the right thing made you a target, fear not for himself, but for the one creature that had never asked him for anything except presence. He took a step toward the gate of the park when another whistle sliced through the cold, this one closer, sharper, as if the first had only been a test, and this was the real call. Ethan turned just as shapes detached themselves from the dark corners near the ramps. A handful of men, not all of them from the group he recognized, but led by the same malice. One of them carried a short length of chain coiled in his hand. Another held something like a leash, though Ethan did not yet see what followed it. His chest tightened, not because he doubted his ability to defend himself, but because he could already feel the shepherd's tension rising beside him. The dog had no patience for games or posturing. It understood threat in a language older than speech. "You did not get the point earlier," one of the men said, voice slick with contempt. Ethan stayed silent, measuring the ground between them. The shepherd's growl was low and steady, not a warning to them, but a confession to him that the line between restraint and action was thinning. A sharp tug on the leash, and the pit bull appeared again, closer this time, no shadow to soften it, only the hard reality of what it had been made into. Its eyes locked on Ethan, and then shifted to the shepherd with a focus that felt almost mechanical. Ethan knew that look too. It was the look of a weapon waiting for permission. His mind raced through options and found them painfully limited. There were too many men, too much distance to close before they could release the dog, and too much risk that the shepherd would be caught in the middle, trying to protect him. He thought, briefly and bitterly, that this was exactly what they wanted, not to kill him outright, but to make him watch something he loved suffer for his choices. The memory came without warning. Another deployment, another dog, a blast that ripped through a dusty road, a handler screaming a name that never got an answer. Ethan had not been the one holding that leash, but he had carried the sound of that scream home inside his skull. He had sworn, quietly, that if he ever had a partner like that, he would not fail them. Now that promise throbbed in his chest like an old wound reopened. The man with the leash smiled without warmth and unhooked it. The pit bull surged forward, not wildly, but with terrifying precision, claws scraping, breath steaming in the air between them. Ethan tried to step aside, to draw the attack toward himself, but the shepherd moved first. There was no hesitation, no calculation, only instinct fueled by a history of standing between Ethan and danger. The dog launched forward, a blur of motion shaped by loyalty rather than training. The collision when they met was brutal and immediate. Ethan heard the impact more than he saw it, a tangle of snarls and growls, a rhythm of struggle that made his stomach twist. He shouted a command he had never needed with this dog before, a word meant to pull it back, to remind it that survival mattered more than pride. But the shepherd was beyond commands, answering instead to something deeper than obedience. To it, there was no world in which it stepped aside and allowed its handler to be torn apart. Teeth found flesh. A choked yelp cut through the air, raw and startled. Ethan's vision narrowed as he rushed toward the fight, his body moving faster than his thoughts. He grabbed for the pit bull's collar for any point of leverage, and was met with a whirl of muscle and fury. One of the men swung the length of chain at him. It glanced off his shoulder with a flash of pain that barely registered. He drove an elbow into the nearest torso, felt the rush of air as the man stumbled back. But he could not break fully into the circle of violence the two dogs had created. He saw the moment the pit bull's jaws closed around the shepherd's neck and shoulder in a crushing grip, saw the way the shepherd's legs buckled, and then stiffened as it fought not to collapse. Red spread across the pale concrete in a widening stain that burned itself into Ethan's mind. Time fractured into sharp fragments. A shout, a curse, another blow swinging toward his head. He ducked, drove forward, forced the man with the chain to the ground, but every part of him remained painfully aware of the sound of his dog struggling to breathe. Rage flared up, hot and useless, because no amount of anger could undo the bite that had already landed. He managed to wrench the pit bull sideways just enough to loosen its grip. The shepherd sagged, chest heaving in short, desperate bursts, yet even as its strength drained, it shifted its body, still trying to keep itself between Ethan and the threat. That sight nearly broke him. The men began to pull back, apparently satisfied with the damage done. One of them whistled and snapped his fingers. The pit bull was dragged away, resisting only in small jerks, its blood-flecked mouth still parted, its breath ragged but alive. "Next time we take the rest," the man said, his eyes flat with promise. Then they melted into the dark edges of the park, leaving behind only the echo of their footsteps, the sting of humiliation, and the terrible quiet that follows violence. Ethan dropped to his knees beside the shepherd. He called the dog's name once firmly, as if he could anchor it to life with tone alone. The dog's eyes flickered open, clouded with pain, yet searching for him, as if needing confirmation that he was still there. Its breathing came in clipped, shallow bursts, each one a battle. Ethan pressed his hand against the worst of the wounds, feeling warmth seep between his fingers, feeling the terrifying fragility of a life that had stood beside him through nights far worse than this. Fear finally arrived in full, not for himself, but for the unbearable possibility that he might have to watch this partner slip away because of choices he had made. He forced his voice steady and murmured soft, urgent words, not commands this time, but pleas disguised as reassurance. The shepherd's gaze softened, and Ethan felt, rather than heard, the faint answer, in the way the dog tried to lean into his hand. There was no time to think about revenge, no space for anger to grow. Only one priority remained: get the dog to help, fast. He gathered the shepherd into his arms, surprised and not surprised at how heavy it felt now that its own strength was failing. Every step toward the exit of the skate park felt like walking through water, his boots slipping slightly on patches of ice and blood. The cold air stabbed at his lungs as he broke into a run, scanning the distant street for any sign of light, any moving car, any chance to reach a veterinary clinic before the breaths he heard against his chest stopped counting forward. As he reached the edge of the park and the city opened up before him in harsh pools, snowmelt dripped from street signs as distant sirens echoed through the empty winter streets. Ethan Walker ran without looking back, the German shepherd held tightly against his chest, its faint breaths like fragile sparks that could be extinguished by any misstep. The icy sidewalks of Hartford Ridge blurred beneath him, streetlights stretching into streaks of gold and white, as if the world itself were racing beside him. His lungs burned, not from exertion, but from fear rising like smoke in his throat. The shepherd's breathing was thin, irregular, each inhale a negotiation with pain, each exhale an uncertain promise that the next would still come. Ethan whispered to it while running, not because the words could heal, but because silence felt like surrender. He remembered long nights overseas when soldiers whispered the names of loved ones to stay awake, to stay alive, to resist slipping into the stillness that followed injury. He whispered now for the same reason, not to calm the dog, but to anchor himself to the rhythm of its pulse. The veterinary clinic stood at the edge of downtown near the shuttered courthouse, its windows glowing with a tired fluorescence that seemed to flicker between hope and exhaustion. Ethan kicked the door open with his shoulder, and the bell above it chimed with a cheer that felt painfully out of place. A woman at the counter, weary-eyed and startled, rushed toward him when she saw the blood, no questions asked, only decisive movement. She shouted a name toward the back, and another figure appeared, a man whose presence radiated competence, someone who had clearly weathered emergencies before. Ethan did not catch their names. Names did not matter when time was measured in heartbeats. All that mattered was action. They took the shepherd from his arms with practiced caution, and Ethan felt an immediate void the moment the weight left his grip, as if something essential had been torn from him. He followed them into a narrow treatment room, stopping only when the man raised a hand, silently instructing him to wait outside the immediate space. Ethan stood at the threshold, close enough to see, far enough to avoid interfering. The shepherd was laid onto a metal table, instruments clattering against trays as the two worked swiftly to stabilize breathing and slow the bleeding. Ethan watched the man's gestures, quick, confident, focused. He watched the woman's hands press gauze firmly, her lips moving as if reciting steps to herself. He watched the shepherd's chest rise and fall in uneven waves, and with each rise he felt a slight release of tension, and with each fall he felt his heart strain in fear. A memory surfaced without warning. Another winter, another injured companion, A moment when someone he trusted bled out before medics could arrive. Ethan had held that soldier's hand as if his grip alone could replace lost blood. It hadn't. He remembered promising himself he would never again stand by helpless while someone he cared for slipped away. Yet here he was, standing motionless, fingers curling into fists so tight that his nails bit into his palms. He told himself he wasn't helpless this time. He had carried the dog here. He had not allowed the fight to end in silence. He had not frozen or faltered. But doubt lingered, stubborn and sharp, because saving a life did not stop with effort. It demanded outcome, and outcomes were never guaranteed. The shepherd's eyes fluttered open once, briefly, not searching the room, not scanning for threats, but seeking one presence, his. Ethan stepped closer, ignoring the unspoken boundary, and placed his hand near the dog's paw without touching it, afraid that pressure might break something fragile. The shepherd's gaze steadied on him, and in that look, Ethan felt a mix of gratitude, pain, and loyalty so pure it hurt more than any physical wound. He murmured words he barely recognized as his own, prayers disguised as thanks, apologies disguised as encouragement. The dog blinked slowly, as if acknowledging every syllable, then drifted back into unconsciousness. The man nodded once to the woman, and she adjusted an IV line with a precision that made Ethan feel both hopeful and powerless. Minutes stretched into something indistinguishable, time bending around the sound of beeping monitors and rustling equipment. Ethan's mind drifted again to the men who had unleashed this fate, and anger surged like a storm behind his ribs, but rage could not cross this threshold now, not while breath still trembled in the shepherd's chest. Revenge could wait, survival could not. Hours passed, though Ethan could not say how many. The city outside went quiet as snowfall began again, thin flakes tapping against the window like distant fingers. The treatment slowed, instruments were put aside, and the two figures stepped away from the table. The man finally looked at Ethan, not with triumph, not with defeat, but with a measured calm that told Ethan more than words could. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging what that silence meant. The shepherd lived, but barely, and the fight was far from over. They moved the dog to a recovery area, a dim room filled with low hums of machines and soft blankets arranged like makeshift nests. Ethan followed, refusing to leave, ignoring his own exhaustion. The woman returned briefly with a mug of something warm and placed it near him without comment. He didn't drink it, but appreciated the gesture. He pulled a metal chair close to the dog's side and sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely, as if holding something invisible he could not afford to drop. The shepherd's breaths came softer now, more rhythm than struggle, but still frail, still fragile. Ethan watched them the way a drowning man watches the shoreline, each one a promise of possibility, each one a reminder of how little control he had. He spoke quietly, sharing fragments of thoughts he had never intended to voice. Memories of training days when he was sure of everything, regrets he had tried to bury beneath duty, fears that gnawed at him in the quiet hours when no one was there to witness the unraveling. The dog could not respond, yet Ethan felt heard in a way he rarely did among people. Perhaps because the shepherd had never judged him, never asked for explanations, never demanded that Ethan be anything other than present. As exhaustion crept into his bones, Ethan rested his forehead lightly against his clasped hands and let his breathing match the rhythm beside him. He did not sleep, not fully, but drifted at the edge of consciousness, suspended between vigilance and surrender. Each shift of the dog's breathing stirred him awake again. Each pause seized his attention until the next inhale returned. When the dog whimpered faintly in its sleep, Ethan whispered reassurance until the muscles relaxed and stillness returned. Outside, the snowfall thickened, muting the sounds of the city, as though the world itself wanted to wrap the recovery room in quiet refuge. Ethan finally leaned back, eyes closed for a moment, letting the warmth of the room soak into him, letting the truth settle inside him like embers refusing to die out. The shepherd had survived the night, but the threat still lingered. The men who had come for him once would come again, and next time they would not be content with warnings or half-measures. Ethan opened his eyes, gaze drifting toward the window where snow swirled beneath a street lamp. His thoughts sharpened into a promise he did not speak aloud. He would not be caught unprepared again. Then the shepherd's breathing stuttered, just once, barely noticeable, yet enough to send Ethan upright in an instant, heart hammering with dread, uncertain whether it was a harmless shift or the first sign of something far worse. Wind scraped against the clinic windows as the city held its breath beneath falling snow. Ethan Walker sat beside the German shepherd through the long hours that blurred into a pale dawn, his mind balancing between fatigue and vigilance as the machines hummed a rhythm that felt more fragile than it sounded. The dog's breathing was still uneven, but steadier than the night before, offering a glimmer of hope that Ethan clung to even as doubt gnawed quietly at him. He wanted to believe survival was guaranteed now, that endurance alone had earned them a brief peace, yet he knew better than to mistake temporary calm for safety. The past had taught him that threats rarely vanished simply because he wished them gone. They waited, patient and vindictive. When a nurse entered to check vitals and adjust equipment, Ethan stood and backed away just enough to give space without taking his eyes off the shepherd. The nurse worked quickly, murmuring to herself, and when she left, Ethan remained still for several moments, feeling the weight of silence settle again. His exhaustion made the room tilt slightly at the edges, but he resisted closing his eyes. Rest could come later. For now, presence was all he had to offer. By late afternoon, hunger finally pried its way into his awareness, subtle at first and then relentless, reminding him that he had not eaten since before the attack. Reluctance burned in him as he considered leaving even for a moment, but the vet assured him they would keep watch while he stepped out to get food. Ethan hesitated long enough to feel ashamed of his hesitation. He was a soldier trained to act decisively, yet here he was, afraid to take a dozen steps beyond the building. He rested a hand gently near the shepherd's head without touching, and whispered a reassurance meant for both of them, then forced himself outside into the cold. The wind sliced at his face as he crossed the parking lot, flakes of snow catching in his breath, and he felt the city's winter tighten around him like a warning. He told himself he would be quick, but every step away felt like walking against instinct, as if invisible threads tried to pull him back toward the clinic. Inside a small grocery across the street, he moved mechanically through aisles, grabbing food without care for taste, thoughts drifting always to the recovery room. When he paid, his hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the uneasy certainty that something was wrong. He had been gone too long already. He rushed out, nearly slipping on the icy pavement, and sprinted back across the street. As he neared the entrance, he saw nothing unusual from the outside, but unease sharpened into urgency, and he shoved through the door with a force that sent the bell chiming harshly. Inside, the clinic lights glowed softly, too softly, as if disguising a shift in the air he could not yet name. Ethan strode past the front desk and through the corridor toward the recovery room, his pulse thudding louder with each step. Two figures stood near the shepherd's bed, their posture too still, their attention too fixed on the IV line. Neither wore clinic uniforms. At first, Ethan froze, his mind struggling to process what he saw, but instinct surged faster than conscious thought. He recognized the tension in their movements, the way their shoulders hunched slightly as if ready to flee, the guilty stillness of men who had done something they could not undo. A small vial lay on the tray beside them, half concealed by a cloth. The IV line dripped steadily. Ethan felt his stomach twist, his thoughts collapsing into a single truth. He had left for minutes, and that was long enough for the enemy to strike. A sharp tremor shook the shepherd's body, its legs stiffening for an instant, before spasms rippled through its muscles. The sound the dog made was faint, but filled with agony, a whimper that hit Ethan like a blade. Fury rose so quickly he could barely breathe. The two intruders turned in alarm as Ethan lunged forward, his movements shaped by muscle memory older than fear. He grabbed the first by the collar and slammed him against the wall hard enough to rattle a row of metal hooks, then twisted to catch the second before he could reach the hallway. Ethan struck with precision, not with blind rage. His blows landed where they would disable rather than kill, though death felt dangerously close to his thoughts. He forced himself to stop before crossing that line, his chest heaving as the men crumpled on the floor. He shouted for help, his voice echoing off the tile, and clinic staff rushed in with alarmed faces. The vet moved instantly toward the shepherd, disconnecting the IV and checking vitals, while the woman at his side prepared emergency injections with trembling hands. Ethan could barely watch, but he refused to look away. The shepherd convulsed once more, then lay still, breaths shallow and irregular. The vet barked instructions to the woman, and together they worked with urgent precision, flushing the line, administering counteragents, massaging muscles to keep circulation steady. Ethan gripped the edge of a metal table so tightly his knuckles whitened, silently begging the dog to hold on. The room pulsated with tension, monitors beeping unevenly, until finally the rhythm shifted, breaths evening into a fragile cadence. Relief washed through Ethan so abruptly his legs nearly buckled, but he caught the edge of the counter and steadied himself, focusing on the rise and fall of the dog's chest. When the vet nodded without speaking, Ethan exhaled shakily, though his relief was tainted by dread and fury. The two attackers groaned on the floor, half-conscious, and Ethan stared at them with a coldness that frightened even him. The vet told him the shepherd needed rest, that the danger had not passed, but the crisis had been delayed. Ethan thanked him quietly, but did not stay. Instead, he grabbed the attackers, dragging them out of the clinic and into the freezing evening air. Snowflakes melted on their faces as they begged, but Ethan ignored their voices. He threw them into the back of his truck, bound their wrists, and drove toward the cabin he kept outside the city limits, a place no one visited unless invited. The road curved through patches of forest, branches heavy with ice, and Ethan felt the calm of the night mocking him. He repeated one question over and over in his thoughts. Who sent them? Their fear did not interest him. Their answers did. At the cabin he dragged them inside, lit a single lamp, and stared until they trembled beneath the silence. He asked once, his voice low, and the first man spoke quickly, terrified. Ethan listened, heart pounding with growing certainty as pieces began to align. The second man confirmed what the first had said, and Ethan felt anger settle into a cold focus that steadied him more than rest ever could. He had names now, directions, places to go, debts to collect. Outside, wind scraped against the cabin walls, and the night seemed to lean closer, as if eager to witness what he would do next. But Ethan did not allow impulses to lead him. He left the attackers tied under watchful eyes of the quiet woods and returned to his truck, one destination filling his thoughts like a call he could not ignore. The shepherd was alive, but only barely, and Ethan knew he had no room left for caution or delay. As he drove back toward the city, headlights slicing through snow, his phone buzzed once in his pocket with an incoming call. It was the clinic. The number alone made his pulse spike, and his breath caught in the still air of the cab as he reached for the phone, fearing what he might hear next. Snow thickened along the forest road as dawn failed to warm the frozen horizon. Ethan Walker drove back toward Hartford Ridge with a clarity that felt almost frightening, his thoughts whittled down to a single edge sharper than anger itself. The German shepherd was still alive in the clinic, breaths fragile but steady, and every inhale the dog fought for tightened the coil in Ethan's chest. He no longer felt the confusion or hesitation that had clouded him the night before. Something inside had settled into place, and that stillness was more dangerous than rage. He knew the names the attackers had spoken, the building where their associates gathered, the hours they ran their operations, and the weaknesses they believed were secrets. He had not asked for mercy when gathering that information, and he did not intend to give any now. Mercy had lost its place the moment poison had touched his dog's blood. As he neared the industrial district, the wind howled along empty warehouses, rattling loose sheet metal like distant applause. Ethan parked 2 blocks from the target building to avoid being seen, then stepped out into the cold with movements precise enough to betray his training. He kept his steps light, not because he feared discovery, but because instinct reminded him that silence was power. The building ahead had once been a repair shop, now a front for the gang's operations. Faint music leaked from inside, voices rising in drunken arrogance. The kind of careless confidence that came from believing revenge had already been earned the night before. Ethan paused outside the side entrance, pressing his hand against the cold metal door and letting his thoughts travel backward through memories of breaching rooms overseas. He felt the familiar hum beneath his skin, that quiet awakening of discipline, timing, and focus. It was not excitement, it was purpose. He cut power to the building by flipping a breaker panel behind a stack of crates, sending the interior into sudden darkness. The shouts inside were immediate and confused, some taunting, some irritated, none aware of what was coming. Ethan slipped through the side door before they could reach it, his eyes adjusting quickly, guided more by sound and memory than sight. He moved through the shadows with the certainty of someone who had lived his adulthood in places where noise meant death. Voices clustered toward the center of the garage, arguing about whether the blackout was a prank, a blown fuse, or something else entirely. Ethan did not give them time to decide. The first man never saw him approach. Ethan struck with just enough force to drop him silently. The second shouted in surprise, but went down before finishing the word, silenced by a blow that stole breath and will. The third tried to swing a wrench in the dark, but Ethan caught the motion and redirected it, sending the man crashing into a workbench with a gasp that choked into silence. Ethan's actions were efficient rather than brutal, but each movement carried the weight of betrayal, fear, and the memory of the shepherd's pain. He still felt the warmth of the dog's blood on his hands, even though they had been scrubbed clean hours earlier. It lingered like a reminder not of weakness, but of the cost of restraint. A man lunged toward him with a knife, and Ethan disarmed him with a twist that ended in a pained cry. Another charged blindly, yelling curses, but Ethan stepped aside and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the floor where he stayed, breath knocked out of him. Shadows shifted near the back office, and Ethan advanced without hesitation, his breathing even, heartbeat steady, mind clear. A figure stepped forward holding a gun, but the safety was still on, and the hesitation cost him. Ethan closed the distance and knocked him out cold with a strike that resonated like a gavel hitting wood. Someone switched on a flashlight, its beam wobbling across the room, revealing faces pale with fear. They tried to form a defensive line, but they lacked the discipline to hold. Ethan confronted them with a calmness that unsettled their courage. And within moments, the light dropped again, and several bodies hit the floor, either unconscious or unwilling to rise. The entire encounter lasted minutes, yet, to Ethan, it felt longer, stretched by the pressure of memory and the echo of his own promise. He knew he was walking the edge between justice and vengeance, and though he did not cross it in action, the thought lingered, asking silently whether holding back was wisdom or cowardice. He forced the question aside. Reflection could come later, when lives no longer hung in balance. He needed to press forward, deeper into the building, where the ones who gave the orders would be hiding. Before he could move, his phone buzzed once in his pocket, startling him, not because of the sound, but because of the timing. He pulled it out with steady hands, expecting an update from the clinic, fearing words he could not bear. But the screen showed a number not saved in his contacts, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. Then instinct whispered otherwise. He answered, his voice low. A tense silence followed, then a voice unfamiliar but controlled. "We know what you're doing." Ethan felt his grip tighten around the device. The voice continued, tone flat, as if reporting weather rather than delivering threat. "You think we won't strike again? We can take what you care about any time. You can't watch it forever." Ethan's jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady, shaped by experience. He asked who he was speaking to, but the line cut before he finished. For a moment he stood still, phone cooling in his hand, the silence of the building pressing close again. Around him, the subdued groans of defeated men blended with the low hum of emergency lights beginning to flicker as power attempts restarted. He tucked the phone away, gaze sharpening, as he moved toward a door that led deeper underground, where he suspected the true architect of this revenge waited. Yet as he reached for the handle, something inside paused, not out of fear, but calculation. The shepherd was still fighting for its life. He could not afford to let this confrontation consume more time than he had. The voice on the phone had not been a confession. It had been a reminder. The balance of time and danger was shifting, and every decision could cost him everything he had left. He gripped the doorframe, feeling his pulse settle into a steady rhythm shaped by resolve. Then he pushed forward into darkness, unaware that another call was already waiting for him at the clinic, one that would reshape his priorities before the night was over. Streetlights flickered against abandoned warehouses as sirens wailed somewhere far beyond the industrial district. Ethan Walker paused just inside the metal door leading underground, the cold air from the corridor rising like breath from a buried animal. The defeated gang members above groaned faintly where they lay, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the racing pulse in Ethan's ears. He had come here to confront the source of everything that had poisoned his life these past days. Yet, standing on the threshold, he felt a tug inside his chest, a reminder that every second spent here was another second stolen from the German shepherd's fragile fight for life. The phone call he had received still echoed in his mind, its warning sharp. They could strike again, anytime, anywhere, and Ethan knew well enough that threats spoken calmly were the ones most likely to be carried out. But leaving now would mean letting the gang regroup, letting the ringleader erase evidence, letting the net tighten around him and the dog all over again. He drew a breath, steady and measured, and descended the stairs. The corridor below was dimly lit by emergency lights, stuttering along the ceiling, flickering shadows into shapes that resembled memories more than danger. Ethan forced himself to stay present. Imagination was a luxury, and sentimentality was poison. As he reached the bottom, he heard voices behind a reinforced door, low and uneasy, as though the fear he had sown upstairs had already begun to seep downward. He pushed the door open without hesitation. The room beyond was wide and cluttered with crates and old machinery, but Ethan barely registered the objects. His attention locked instantly onto the man tied to a chair near the center, guarded by two others who turned sharply at Ethan's entrance. The bound man was older than the others, shoulders slumped, not from defeat but exhaustion, and the moment his eyes met Ethan's, something wary flickered there, recognition perhaps, or the quiet knowledge that the storm outside was now standing in front of him. The two guards drew weapons, not firearms, but knives held with an overconfidence that betrayed lack of training. Ethan did not waste breath on words. He moved with ruthless precision, as if each step and strike were decisions made years ago and only now carried out. One guard went down silently from a chokehold, body collapsing into unconsciousness. The second slashed wildly, rage replacing skill, but Ethan parried and sent him crashing into a stack of crates that groaned under the impact. Neither rose again. The bound man exhaled in a way that did not sound like relief, more like resignation. Ethan stepped closer, every muscle prepared for one last struggle, but the man shook his head slowly and spoke in a hoarse voice that suggested nights without sleep. He said he had once run the operation, had built it out of greed and stubbornness, but after the arrests Ethan had triggered months ago, the gang had splintered into factions, some of which acted without his command. He claimed he had not ordered the poisoning of the dog. He said newer members sought revenge on their own to prove loyalty. Ethan's hands tightened around the back of the chair, torn between disbelief and the grim logic of criminal hierarchies. He thought of the two attackers at the clinic, the desperation in their eyes, the tremor in their voices when they revealed their orders. No glory, no money promised, only vengeance delivered through suffering. Ethan felt anger churn, but not flare. It moved like molten iron through his veins, slow and searing. He asked the bound man who still held power, who still planned to finish what had been started. The answer came reluctantly. A lieutenant who had risen in the power vacuum, a man driven not by business but pride, the kind of leader who valued cruelty as currency. Ethan memorized the name, rolled it silently across his thoughts like a stone he would soon throw through a window of certainty. He leaned closer and asked a final question, not about power or orders, but motive. Why go after the dog instead of him? The man hesitated, then replied that some enemies understand the worst pain is not physical harm, but forcing someone to witness harm done to what they love. The words struck Ethan like ice water, and he realized the truth in them, not because he accepted cruelty, but because he felt the shadow of that cruelty still lying in the hospital bed miles away. For a moment Ethan could not speak. He thought of overseas nights when he had seen men break not from torture, but from losing the one creature that trusted them without hesitation. He wondered if those memories had shaped him into someone too easily wounded by loyalty. A vibration buzzed through his pocket, and Ethan answered before the second ring. The vet's voice was tense yet controlled, reporting that the shepherd's condition had shifted again, still alive, but weakening, its heartbeat faltering between intervals that grew longer, as though the dog were hesitating between staying and leaving. Ethan felt the corridor of his chest collapse inward, everything narrowing to a pinpoint of urgency. The vet added that if Ethan wanted to say anything the dog needed to hear, now was the time. Ethan ended the call without a word, and stood motionless for a breath that felt too long. The bound man whispered something faint, maybe an apology or a warning, but Ethan did not listen. He untied the ropes without looking the man in the eyes, not out of mercy, but because the fight for survival had shifted elsewhere. He turned toward the exit, every instinct screaming the same direction. The captive called after him quietly, asking the single question he had not expected. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan paused only long enough for his heartbeat to steady, and though he said nothing, the silence carried the answer. Survival would come first. Reckoning would follow. As Ethan climbed the stairs to the surface, snowflakes drifted through the open doorway, and he felt the cold sharpen his senses like a blade as his truck roared back to life. The shepherd needed him now, and the next battle would not be fought with fists or knives, but with time itself. And Ethan drove into the storm with the terrifying certainty that he might be running toward a goodbye he was not prepared to speak. Falling snow glimmered under the street lamps as dawn strained to break the frozen night. Ethan Walker drove back toward the clinic with a focus stripped of every distraction except the fading rhythm of the German shepherd's breathing that still pulsed in his memory, each echo of it reminding him how close loyalty had come to being extinguished. He did not wonder whether he should have stayed longer in the underground room or questioned the half-confession of the former ringleader. Those thoughts dissolved beneath the urgency that now guided him like instinct. His truck cut through streets made nearly silent by snowfall, passing shuttered shops and empty benches, places that once felt harmless but now held echoes of violence and choices that could not be undone. At a red light, he slowed without fully stopping, his foot hovering over the brake pedal as if time itself waited on his decision. And as the light changed, he accelerated again, unwilling to lose a heartbeat more than necessary. When the clinic came into view, its windows glowing faintly through the drifting veil of snow, Ethan felt his chest tighten with a fear that had nothing to do with danger to himself. It was the fear of arriving too late, of realizing effort had carried him only as far as inevitability. He pushed through the doors with less force than expected, as though sudden violence might shatter something delicate within. Inside, a nurse lifted her gaze, recognition flickering briefly before she gestured for him to follow. She said nothing, her silence a kindness he did not know he needed, and he walked behind her through the softly lit corridor toward the recovery room that had become a lifeline between what was lost and what might still endure. The vet waited inside, his hands clasped as though anchoring himself to routine, and he looked up when Ethan entered with an expression that balanced professionalism and gravity. He reported that the shepherd's heartbeat had weakened again, that its breaths came more slowly, as if pulled from a distant place, and that they were doing everything they could, but there were no guarantees. Ethan listened without interrupting, not because he accepted the possibility of loss, but because he understood that disbelief would not help the dog breathe. He moved to the bedside and lowered himself onto the chair that had held him through the long night, and when his hand reached toward the shepherd, he stopped just short, remembering how fragile the animal's strength was now. The shepherd's eyes opened a fraction at the sound of his voice when he spoke quietly. Not commands this time, not encouragement, but truths he had carried for years without saying aloud. He told the dog how its presence had kept him steady when sleep became a battlefield and silence became heavier than gunfire, how training missions and deployments had hardened him in ways that felt irreversible until a companion with unwavering loyalty reminded him that trust was not weakness. The shepherd blinked slowly as though absorbing each word, its focus wavering between consciousness and the distant pull of exhaustion, and Ethan felt the air around them thicken with something deeper than memory or fear. For a moment the room held only the soft hum of machinery and the snow-touched wind outside, and Ethan leaned closer, letting his presence speak where words could no longer reach. He whispered the dog's name with a steadiness that did not mask his trembling breath, and as he did, the shepherd exhaled once, shakily, then again with greater effort, its chest lifting less with each attempt. Ethan feared the moment had come, and for an instant everything inside him clenched, but he refused to let dread shape his demeanor, holding instead to the belief that loyalty might still anchor life. He rested his forehead near the shepherd's head without touching, closing his eyes to steady himself, and spoke the final truth he had withheld longest, that he was not finished standing with the dog, that whatever battles remained, he would not walk through them alone, that the world still demanded their shared presence. When he opened his eyes again, the shepherd's breathing hitched once more, but this time the pause was followed by a faint, yet deliberate inhale, as if the dog reached into some memory of duty and pulled strength from it. The vet stepped closer but did not intervene, sensing that something beyond medicine was taking place, and Ethan held his breath while watching the dog fight for another inhalation, another connection to the world that had nearly pushed it out. The heartbeat monitor did not surge with sudden strength, but its rhythm steadied, no longer slipping toward silence but climbing back with fragile persistence, and in that moment Ethan felt his chest loosen with a relief that nearly unmade him. He did not celebrate and did not collapse. Instead, he placed his hand gently near the shepherd's paw, letting warmth pass between them like an oath that could be spoken only through presence. Hours passed without his awareness of them, each minute layered with the slow rebuilding of strength, and though the vet reminded him recovery would take time and vigilance, Ethan accepted the truth with quiet resolve. He made arrangements for safe transport once the dog could move, knowing the city still held danger, but for now he felt no need for speed or retaliation. Justice and reckoning could wait until the shepherd no longer clung to life by threads of devotion alone. When the sun finally rose through the thinning snowfall, painting the clinic hallway with pale light, the shepherd slept with breaths steadier than they had been in days, and Ethan walked outside only long enough to feel the cold air against his face. The sky held no promise of peace, the roads were still dangerous, but as the wind carried traces of snow across the street, Ethan found himself breathing more deeply, as though part of him had returned from a place he feared losing forever. He knew the scars would not disappear, neither his nor the dog's, yet scars were not symbols of defeat. They were reminders of survival, of battles faced and endured. When he returned to the recovery room, the shepherd stirred slightly, as though sensing him, and Ethan sat again in the chair with a steadiness that felt like arrival rather than exhaustion. He spoke no words this time because none were needed. They had come back to life together, and that was enough to close the chapter that winter had begun. Outside, the snow continued to fall, not as a shroud, but as a quiet witness to the bond that had refused to break, and for the first time in days, Ethan Walker allowed himself to breathe without fear of the next breath being the last. Some people say miracles belong to ancient scriptures, locked away in stories told by candlelight. But sometimes, in the small and trembling space between one heartbeat and the next, we are reminded that miracles still walk among us. Not always as blazing signs in the sky, but as loyalty that refuses to die, love that holds on through the cold, and the quiet strength that pulls a life back from the edge when logic says there is nothing left to save. Maybe it was the steady hands of the doctors. Maybe it was the bond between a soldier and his only true companion. Or maybe, just maybe, God reached into that room, into that fragile moment, and breathed life where silence was waiting. If you've ever had a day where you felt too tired to keep going, or a night where you believed no one heard your prayers, I hope this story reminds you that hope can rise again in the most unexpected places. That loyalty, faith, and love still move mountains, even if the world forgets to notice. If this story touched your heart today, I ask you to do 3 small things. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that miracles still happen. Leave a comment so others can feel your voice standing with them. Subscribe to the channel to walk with us through the next story of faith, loyalty, and second chances. And tonight, before you close your eyes, take one quiet moment, just one, to pray. Pray for those who are lost, for those fighting battles we cannot see, and for every loyal companion who stands guard over a fragile soul. May God bless you. May God watch over your family, and may He guide every step you take, even through the snow. Amen.